Welcome back, everyone. If you've been here before, thank you truly. And if this is your first time stumbling into this quiet corner of the internet tonight, settle in. You're exactly where you're meant to be. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this. The year is 1872. You are 23 years old. You step off a train onto a platform slick with coal soot and rain, carrying nothing but a small leather bag, a handful of coins, and no idea, none at all, where you will sleep tonight. You don't know a single soul in this city. No family waiting, no room reserved, just the roar of a place that doesn't know you exist yet. Horse-drawn carriages rattling over cobblestone, the hiss of gas lamps being lit one by one as dusk settles in, the smell of coal smoke, wet wool, and rain-soaked brick. You could be in London, or Manchester, or Boston, or Philadelphia. It hardly matters, because in the 1800s, this exact scene was playing out, night after night, in almost every industrial city on both sides of the Atlantic. And then, a stranger on the platform, noticing the lost look on your face, points down a narrow street. "Try there," they say. "Number 14, she takes lodgers." You walk. You find the door. An ordinary door, on an ordinary street, in an ordinary row of houses that all look the same in the fog. But beside the doorframe, there's a small brass plaque, polished by countless hands before yours. Rooms available. You knock. And somewhere behind that door, behind hundreds of thousands of doors just like it, across an entire century, a story is about to begin. A story of strangers becoming something like family. Of secrets kept behind thin bedroom walls. Of a woman who ran an entire household on nothing but grit, arithmetic, and quiet authority. And as you'll come to learn tonight, a story with at least one mystery that was never fully solved. This is the story of the Victorian boarding house, one of the strangest, most human, and most forgotten institutions of the 19th century. A world hidden in plain sight in nearly every city you've ever heard of. And tonight, we're stepping through that door together. Before we go further, if stories like this help you unwind or drift off, feel free to let this play in the background. There's no need to catch every word. Just let the history wash over you, the way rain might fall against a window pane on a night, just like the one we're about to describe. Now, let's go back. Not to the doorstep yet, but further, to understand why that door even existed. Why, by the second half of the 19th century, an entire generation of young men and women found themselves standing on unfamiliar platforms, in unfamiliar cities, with nowhere else to turn. Because to understand the boarding house, you first have to understand the flood of people who needed it, the flood into the cities. To understand why a stranger could knock on a stranger's door and be handed a room, a bed, and a place at the dinner table, you have to understand just how fast the 19th century was changing. In the year 1800, London was home to roughly 900,000 people. It was already one of the largest cities on Earth. But by 1900, just one century later, that number had exploded past 6 million. 6 times larger. And London wasn't unique. Manchester, Birmingham, Glasgow, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, nearly every industrial city on both sides of the Atlantic was swelling at a pace no one had ever seen before, and no one was quite prepared for. Why? The answer, in a word, is industry. Factories were rising where fields used to be. Railways were stitching the countryside to the city faster than any stagecoach ever could. And with every new mill, every new office, every new railway line came the same hungry question: who is going to do all this work? The answer came from the countryside. Week after week, month after month, young men and women packed what little they owned and left behind the farms, villages, and small towns where their families had lived for generations. They weren't fleeing disaster. Most of them were chasing something simpler: a wage, a chance, a life beyond the field they'd been born into. But here is the detail that so often gets left out of the history books. Almost none of these young migrants could afford, or even wanted, to rent an entire house. Think about what that would actually require in the 1800s. Furniture, coal for a fire, in every room, every day. A working knowledge of cooking, laundry, cleaning, skills many young factory workers, particularly young men, simply didn't have. And even if they had the skills, they didn't have the time. A typical workday in a Victorian factory or shop could stretch 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours. There was no leftover energy to scrub floors or bake bread after a shift like that. So a new kind of arrangement quietly filled the gap. Not a hotel. Those were for travelers, and far too expensive for anyone earning a factory wage. Not a family member's home, because increasingly, these young workers had no family in the city at all. Instead, an entirely different institution rose up in nearly every industrial neighborhood: the boarding house. Historian Wendy Gamber, who has spent much of her career studying this exact institution, put it simply: those who couldn't cook for themselves paid someone else to cook for them. That's the boarding house in a single sentence. But behind that simple description was an entire hidden economy, an entire social world that we've almost completely forgotten. Let's look at just how widespread this really was. According to the 1850 census in England, roughly 1 in every 8 households included a lodger, not a guest, not a relative staying over the holidays, a paying stranger sleeping under the same roof as a family that, in most cases, had never met them before the day they moved in. And in certain cities, Nottingham, York, and other fast-growing industrial towns, that number climbed even higher, to nearly 1 household in 5. Pause on that for a moment. In some cities, walking down any given street, you could knock on 1 door in 5 and find a stranger living inside, paying rent to sleep in what used to be someone's spare bedroom, or parlor, or attic. This wasn't a fringe arrangement. This wasn't unusual or scandalous. By the mid-1800s, taking in lodgers had become one of the most ordinary things a household could do, as common as owning a dog or attending church on Sunday. And it wasn't confined to England either. Across the Atlantic, American cities were experiencing an almost identical transformation. Boston, Philadelphia, New York, all absorbing waves of both domestic migrants from rural America and immigrants arriving fresh off the ships from Ireland, Germany, Italy, and beyond. Historians estimate that at the height of the boarding house era, as much as 1/3 of urban Americans either boarded in someone else's home or took boarders into their own. 1/3. Think about that. In some decades, boarding wasn't the exception to normal city life. It very nearly was normal city life. So who opened their doors to all these strangers? Who decided to turn a spare room, or in many cases, several rooms, sometimes an entire house, into a lodging business? Overwhelmingly, the answer is women. And this is where the story of the boarding house becomes something much more than just a housing arrangement. It becomes the story of a very particular kind of Victorian woman, one who, through circumstance rather than choice, became one of the only kinds of businesswomen her society would tolerate. We'll meet her properly in the next part of tonight's story. But for now, picture her standing in that doorway, the woman behind the brass plaque that reads "Rooms Available," about to let a stranger into her home, her table, and in many ways, her life. Because running a boarding house was never simply about renting out a bed. It meant feeding, managing, and often quietly caring for a rotating cast of strangers, clerks, factory girls, sailors between voyages, students, immigrants fresh off the boat, and occasionally someone whose past or intentions were not quite what they seemed. And that's where our story is about to take its first turn. The landlady: rules, routine, and quiet authority. Let's give her a name, not a real historical figure, but a composite built from the letters, diaries, and city directories historians have pieced together from thousands of women just like her. Let's call her Mrs. Whitfield. Mrs. Whitfield is 44 years old. She is a widow. Her husband, a clerk at a shipping firm, died 3 years ago. Of what? The records rarely say. Consumption, most likely, or an accident at the docks. Either way, he left her a modest row house in a respectable but unglamorous part of the city, a small amount of savings that would not last more than a year or two, and absolutely no way to earn a living that Victorian society considered acceptable for a woman of her station. She could not, in the eyes of her world, work in a shop. That was considered beneath a woman who had once been a clerk's wife. She could not easily remarry, not immediately, and not necessarily by choice. She had no trade, no formal education beyond what was expected of the proper Victorian girl. Needlework, some arithmetic, the management of a household, and that, it turns out, was exactly the skill the moment demanded. Historians describe the boarding house as one of the very few respectable paths available to a Victorian woman who suddenly found herself alone and in need of income. It required no formal business training, no capital beyond what she already had. A home, some furniture, and the knowledge of how to run it. What it demanded instead was something Victorian women had been trained for their entire lives, without ever being told it might one day become a profession, the relentless, invisible labor of keeping a household running. So Mrs. Whitfield does the only thing available to her. She puts up the plaque, "Rooms Available," and almost overnight, she becomes something Victorian society had no clear word for. Not quite a businesswoman, not quite a housewife, but something in between. A landlady. Let's walk through what that actually meant, day to day. Her mornings begin before dawn, often as early as 5 o'clock, sometimes earlier if she has boarders who work factory shifts starting at 6. The fires need lighting first, every fireplace in the house, because in the 1800s, a cold house is not just uncomfortable. For elderly boarders or young children, it can be dangerous. Coal has to be carried, ash cleared, kindling arranged, all before anyone else in the house has opened their eyes. Then comes breakfast. And this is where the arithmetic of running a boarding house becomes almost unbelievably complex. Mrs. Whitfield might have 6, 8, sometimes 10 boarders under her roof at any given time, each with different schedules. The factory workers need to eat and leave by 6. The office clerks might not need breakfast until 8. Someone on a night shift might be coming in as everyone else is going out. She has to know, precisely, who eats when, who takes tea and who takes coffee, who can afford the good bacon and who is on a tighter arrangement that includes only bread and drippings. And she has to manage all of this with a household budget stretched thinner than anyone outside her four walls will ever fully understand. This is the part of boarding house life that historians emphasize again and again. The landlady wasn't simply providing a room. She was running what was, in every meaningful sense, a small business. Without any of the tools a modern business owner would take for granted. No accounting software, no bank loans easily available to a widow, no legal protections if a boarder simply packed up in the night, owing 3 weeks' rent. She kept the books herself, usually in a small ledger kept in a kitchen drawer. Every week, she had to work out exactly which tradesman needed paying. The butcher, the coal merchant, the laundress who came twice a week, and in what order, because rarely could everyone be paid on time. She had to decide, boarder by boarder, whether a request for an extra blanket in November or a second helping at dinner was something the household could absorb, or something that would tip her careful balance into debt. And she had to do all of this while maintaining something equally important and far harder to quantify: respectability. This is a detail modern audiences often miss entirely. A boarding house was not simply a financial arrangement. It was, in the eyes of Victorian society, a moral one. A landlady who ran a loose house, where men and women boarders mixed too freely, where late nights and closed doors raised eyebrows among the neighbors, could lose everything. Not just boarders, her entire reputation, and with it, her only means of survival. So the rules of a well-run boarding house were strict, and they were everywhere. Meals at fixed times, and boarders expected to be punctual. A locked front door by a certain hour. 10 o'clock in many houses, earlier in the strictest ones, after which a latecomer might find themselves knocking and waiting, humiliated, on the front step. Male and female boarders, if a house took both, were often assigned to entirely separate floors, with the landlady's own bedroom frequently positioned as a kind of guard post between them. Parlors, the shared sitting rooms where boarders might read, write letters, or make quiet conversation in the evening, were almost always supervised, at least indirectly. A landlady with a sharp ear could usually tell, from her place in the kitchen or hallway, exactly what kind of conversation was happening in the room next door, and whether it required her attention. And this is where the boarding house starts to become something more than a business arrangement. Because Mrs. Whitfield doesn't just feed and house her boarders. Over months, sometimes years, she comes to know them, genuinely know them, in a way few landlords in history ever have. She knows which boarder gets letters from a sweetheart back home, and which one hasn't received a single letter in 3 months, and pretends not to notice how that silence sits on his face at the dinner table. She knows which boarder is quietly saving every spare coin toward a passage to America, and which one has started coming home smelling of gin more nights than not. She knows, in other words, the private lives of 8 or 10 strangers, lives that, in any other arrangement, she would have no reason to be close to at all. This is the paradox at the very heart of the Victorian boarding house. It was, on paper, a business transaction, a bed, a meal, a fee. But in practice, It became one of the strangest kinds of family the 19th century ever produced. Not related by blood, not bound by marriage, just 8 or 10 strangers thrown together under one roof by nothing more than economic necessity. And somehow, over shared meals and shared walls, becoming something that looked remarkably like kin. Which brings us to the boarders themselves, because every landlady, no matter how careful her rules, no matter how sharp her ear for trouble, eventually took in someone she couldn't quite figure out. Someone whose story didn't quite add up. Someone who, months later, she would still be thinking about. And that's where tonight's story is about to change direction. The lodger in room 7. Every landlady, if you asked her long enough, could tell you about one boarder she never quite forgot. For Mrs. Whitfield, that boarder arrived on a wet Tuesday evening in October of 1874. His name, according to the ledger she kept in the kitchen drawer, was Mr. Edmund Carow. He was, by his own account, 31 years old, unmarried, and recently arrived from the north. Leeds, he said, though he never said it with much certainty, the way a man does when he's naming a place, rather than remembering one. He paid 3 weeks' rent in advance, in coin, without being asked. That alone was unusual enough to make Mrs. Whitfield glance up from her ledger. Most boarders negotiated. Most boarders asked what was included, whether coal was extra, whether Sunday dinner counted toward the weekly fee. Mr. Carow asked none of it. He simply placed the coins on the table, thanked her, and asked which room was his. She gave him room 7, the smallest of the upstairs rooms, tucked at the end of the corridor, with a single window overlooking the narrow lane behind the house, rather than the street. It was not the room she usually gave to a paying boarder who could clearly afford better. But it was the only room free that week, and Mr. Carow did not seem to mind. In the weeks that followed, he became, by every outward measure, the easiest boarder Mrs. Whitfield had ever kept. He rose early. He was never late to a meal and never complained about one, even on the nights when dinner was thinner than she would have liked to serve. He kept his room, as far as she could tell from the state of the linens each week, remarkably tidy. He was polite to the other boarders, the 2 young clerks who shared room 4, the elderly Mrs. Pell in room 2, the factory girl, Susan, who boarded in the small room off the kitchen. He asked after their days. He remembered small details, Susan's younger brother's illness, one of the clerk's upcoming examination. And yet, there was something about Mr. Carow that Mrs. Whitfield could never quite place, and never quite stopped noticing. He never received letters. Not one. In all the months he lodged with her, and in a house full of boarders separated from family, letters were the currency of connection, the thing everyone waited for, the thing everyone talked about at dinner. I had a letter from my mother today. My sister writes that the harvest was poor this year. Mr. Carow never mentioned a letter, never asked if the post had come for him, and, Mrs. Whitfield noticed, though she said nothing, never seemed to expect one. He also never spoke, in any real detail, about his work. When asked, he would say only that he was employed in trade. A vague enough answer that it discouraged further questions, the way a precise answer never would have. He left the house each morning at the same hour, and returned each evening at the same hour, dressed each day in the same well-kept but unremarkable dark coat, and in nearly a year of boarding under her roof, Mrs. Whitfield never once learned the name of the firm he supposedly worked for. None of this, on its own, was suspicious. Victorian lodging houses were full of quiet private men who kept their business to themselves. Clerks nursing old disappointments, sailors between contracts who preferred not to discuss the sea, men who had left behind pasts they had no wish to revisit at a shared dinner table. Privacy was not a crime. It was, in many cases, simply good manners. But there was one detail that Mrs. Whitfield could never quite reconcile, and it's the detail that survives, in a fragmentary second-hand way, in the account historians have pieced together of this particular house. Twice, in the 11 months Mr. Caro lodged there, Susan, the factory girl, reported seeing a light under his door well past 2 in the morning, long after the house's strict 10 o'clock rule would ordinarily have meant every lamp extinguished. And once, passing his door on her way to the shared washroom at the end of the hall, she said she heard him speaking. Not reading aloud, not talking in his sleep, speaking in a low, steady voice, as though in conversation. But room 7, everyone in the house knew, held only one bed, and Mr. Caro, by every account, had no visitors. Ever. Susan mentioned it once to Mrs. Whitfield, in the kind of hesitant, half-embarrassed way a boarder might raise something they weren't entirely sure was worth mentioning. Mrs. Whitfield, for her part, did what a careful landlady in her position did with any concern that wasn't yet a problem. She filed it away, and she watched. And for a while, nothing more came of it. Mr. Caro continued exactly as before, punctual, polite, unremarkable in every outward way. The strange light under the door, the murmured voice with no one to hear it, these became, in the way that unexplained small things often do in a busy household, simply a curiosity that everyone half forgot, mentioned occasionally at dinner in the same tone one might use to discuss an odd dream, until the last week of September, 1875. That week, 2 things happened, in quick succession, that Mrs. Whitfield would later describe, in a letter to her sister, one of the few surviving fragments of her own words on the matter, as the strangest few days of her entire time, keeping the house. The first was a visitor, a man, well-dressed, unfamiliar to the household, arrived at the front door on a Wednesday afternoon and asked quite directly whether a Mr. Edmund Caro lodged there. Mrs. Whitfield confirmed that he did and offered to send word up that he had a caller. The man declined. He asked instead, carefully, she noted, as though the question had been prepared in advance, how long Mr. Caro had lodged there, whether he kept regular hours, and whether he had ever, to her knowledge, used any name other than Caro. Mrs. Whitfield, by her own account, found the questions unsettling enough that she gave only the barest answers and asked the man his own business. He did not answer directly. He thanked her for her time, said he would call again, and left, and never did call again, not while Mr. Caro remained in the house. The second thing happened 4 days later. Mr. Caro did not come down for dinner. This, in itself, was unheard of. In nearly a year, he had never once missed a meal without informing her in advance. When he failed to appear the following morning as well, Mrs. Whitfield, with Susan standing anxiously behind her, knocked on the door of room 7. There was no answer. She knocked again, and finally, with the particular authority a landlady held over her own house, she used her key. The room was, by every account passed down through the family's later retelling, completely empty. Not simply vacated, emptied. No clothing left in the small wardrobe, no personal effects on the washstand. The bed, oddly, was made with a precision that suggested it hadn't been slept in for at least a night or two before his disappearance was even noticed. And on the small writing desk by the window, where boarders might leave letters for posting, sat exactly one item, an envelope, sealed, addressed simply to Mrs. Whitfield, in a careful, even hand. Inside, according to the account that survives, was payment, in full and beyond what was owed, enough to cover the remainder of the month and then some, along with a short note. No explanation, no forwarding address, just a brief line of thanks for her hospitality and an apology for the abruptness of his departure. Mr. Edmund Carow was never seen at that house again. Mrs. Whitfield, according to her sister's later recollections, made quiet inquiries in the neighborhood, a habit landladies often kept, both out of concern and simple practical need, in case a departing boarder's absence turned out to conceal some debt or scandal that might reflect on the house. She learned nothing. No firm in the city had any record of an Edmund Carow in its employ. No family by that name could be traced through the parish registers she had access to. The well-dressed visitor who had asked such careful questions was never seen in the neighborhood again either. Now, it's worth pausing here to say plainly what history can and cannot tell us. We don't know who Mr. Carow really was. We don't know why a stranger came asking pointed questions about his name and his hours. We don't know who, or what, Susan heard him speaking to, alone, behind a locked door, at 2 a.m. The surviving record, pieced together from a handful of letters and a family's oral history, passed down for generations, simply stops there, at an empty room and a sealed envelope. Historians who study this period offer a range of far more mundane explanations than the ones that might spring to mind on a night like tonight. Perhaps Mr. Carow was in debt, and the well-dressed visitor was a creditor's agent, finally closing in. Perhaps he was fleeing a failed engagement, a family scandal, a name he'd rather leave behind entirely. Not an uncommon reason for a Victorian gentleman to reinvent himself quietly in a new city under a new name. Perhaps the voice Susan heard through the door was nothing more than a man talking to himself, working through some private trouble, in the particular late-night solitude that a rented room in a strange city can produce in anyone. But it's worth noting, and this is a detail that rarely makes it into the tidy, rational explanations, that boarding houses across Victorian England and America have left behind dozens of similar accounts. Lodgers who paid promptly and kept to themselves, who left behind no trace of a past and no forwarding address for a future, who vanished from one house only to presumably reappear under some other name, in another house, another city, another landlady's ledger. Historians have a fairly ordinary explanation for why this pattern repeats so often across the historical record. The boarding house, more than almost any other institution of the 19th century, offered something increasingly rare in a rapidly modernizing world: genuine anonymity. No employer to vouch for you, no neighbors who'd known your family for 3 generations, no parish priest tracking your comings and goings the way one might in a small village. Just a landlady, a weekly fee, and as much, or as little, of yourself as you chose to share across the dinner table. For most boarders, that anonymity was simply a practical convenience. Freedom from the small-town gossip and obligation many of them had left behind in the first place. But for a certain kind of boarder, historians note, that same anonymity offered something else entirely: the chance to become, for a while, whoever they needed to be. A debtor could become a respectable clerk. A man fleeing scandal could become a stranger with no scandal attached to his name at all. And when that borrowed identity was no longer useful or no longer safe, he could simply pay what he owed, leave a polite note, and disappear as completely as he had arrived. Mrs. Whitfield, for her part, kept room 7 empty for nearly a month after Mr. Caro's departure. An unusual choice for a landlady who depended on every room being let. Whether that was caution, superstition, or simply respect for whatever unfinished story had passed through that room, the record doesn't say. Eventually, of course, practicality won out, and a new boarder, a young telegraph operator, this time with an entirely unremarkable and well-documented history, moved into room 7, and life in the house continued much as it had before. But Susan, according to the family's own later account, never quite lost the habit of glancing at that door as she passed it late at night, half expecting, perhaps, to hear that low, steady voice again, speaking to someone who was never there. Life around the table. If the boarding house had a beating heart, it wasn't the front door, and it wasn't any single bedroom. It was the dining table. Picture it, a long table, usually in the front parlor, or a dedicated dining room just off the kitchen, set each evening for however many boarders the house held that season. 6 settings, 8. Sometimes, in a larger house, 10 or more, all crowded elbow to elbow around a table, never quite built for the number of people it was expected to seat. This was where the boarding house revealed itself for what it truly was. Not simply a business arrangement, but a strange, improvised kind of community, assembled entirely by economic necessity rather than by choice. Consider for a moment who might actually be sitting around Mrs. Whitfield's table on a typical evening in 1875. There's Mrs. Pell, in her 60s, a widow of independent means, too modest to keep a house of her own, who has boarded for nearly a decade and is treated, by unspoken agreement, almost as a permanent fixture, closer to family than to a mere tenant. There are the 2 young clerks, Thomas and William, both in their early 20s, both working at rival shipping firms, who have developed the kind of easy rivalry that comes from sharing a room and competing, quietly, for the same modest promotions. There's Susan, 17, who works 12-hour shifts at a nearby textile mill and eats her dinner half asleep on the nights her shift runs long. And there might be a rotating cast of others: a sailor between voyages, a school teacher new to the city, a young man saving every spare shilling toward passage to America. None of these people would, under ordinary circumstances, ever have shared a meal together. Different classes, different backgrounds, different futures. A widow of independent means and a mill girl earning subsistence wages did not, as a rule, sit at the same table in Victorian society. And yet here, under one landlady's roof, bound by nothing more than the simple fact of needing a room and a meal, they did, night after night, for months, sometimes years at a stretch. The meals themselves followed a rhythm that historians have reconstructed in surprising detail, largely from surviving boarding house account books and the letters boarders wrote home describing their new lives in the city. Breakfast was typically the plainest meal: bread, butter if the household budget allowed it, tea, and on better days, bacon or eggs. It was eaten quickly and with little conversation, most boarders racing against the clock of a factory whistle or an office bell. Dinner, the midday meal in many households, rather than the evening one, was often the heartiest, when the landlady's cooking skill and budget were most on display. A joint of meat if the week had gone well, stewed vegetables, a pudding if there was anything to spare for one, and supper, in the evening, tended to be lighter again. Bread, cheese, perhaps the remains of the midday joint stretched thin across another meal. It's worth pausing on just how much skill this actually required from the landlady. Feeding 8 or 10 people 3 times a day on a budget calculated down to the shilling, while accounting for different appetites, different work schedules, and the occasional boarder who could afford a bit extra for better cuts of meat, while another could barely afford his weekly rent. This was logistics and economics as much as it was cooking. Some landladies, historians note, developed almost legendary reputations in their neighborhoods for stretching a budget further than anyone thought possible, and a house known for keeping a good table could command higher rents and a longer waiting list of prospective boarders than a house known merely for cheap beds. But it was the conversation around that table, not the food itself, that gave the Victorian boarding house its particular, irreplaceable character. Because this was, for many boarders, the only sustained social contact they had in an entire day. Remember who these people typically were: young men and women, often still in their teens or 20s, who had left behind every family member and childhood friend they'd ever known, to work long hours in an unfamiliar city among strangers. The dinner table was where that isolation was, at least briefly, interrupted. Surviving letters from boarders describe evenings that sound remarkably familiar to anyone who has ever lived in a shared house. The easy, unguarded conversation that develops between people who see each other every single day, whether or not they ever intended to become close. Thomas and William, the 2 rival clerks, might spend dinner arguing good-naturedly about a cricket match, or comparing notes on a demanding supervisor they both happened to share opinions about. Mrs. Pell, from her position as the table's unofficial elder, might offer opinions, solicited or not, on everything from William's prospects for promotion to Susan's need for a warmer coat before winter set in. It was, in other words, an entirely unplanned kind of family, bound not by blood, but by the simple accumulated weight of shared meals, shared walls, and shared circumstance. And the landlady, more often than not, sat at the head of this table, not merely as the person collecting the rent, but as something closer to its quiet governor. She set the tone. She decided, through the force of her own presence, whether the table was a place of easy warmth or careful formality. She always noticed, when a boarder who was usually talkative had gone quiet for 2 nights running, or when someone's appetite had dropped off in a way that suggested trouble rather than simple distraction. This is a detail historians return to again and again when describing the social function of the Victorian boarding house. The landlady frequently became a kind of informal confidant and counselor to her boarders, whether she sought that role or not. Young women, new to the city, navigating factory work and city life for the first time without a mother's guidance, often turned to their landladies for exactly the kind of advice a mother might once have given. About a troublesome supervisor, an unwelcome suitor, or simply the loneliness of a life lived entirely among strangers. Young men, similarly, sometimes found in an older landlady a stand-in for the domestic authority and quiet wisdom they'd left behind in their mother's kitchens. It's worth noting, too, that the dining table served a function beyond companionship. It was also, in its own quiet way, an informal information network. In a city without telephones, without any of the instant communication we take entirely for granted today, the dinner table was often where a boarder first heard about a job opening at a nearby firm, a room becoming available in a better part of town, or news from home relayed secondhand through another boarder's more recent letter. Boarding houses, historians note, functioned as genuine social infrastructure in cities that otherwise offered very little support to young, unconnected migrants trying to establish themselves. Not every evening around the table was warm, of course. Historians are careful not to romanticize the boarding house too heavily, and the surviving record makes clear that friction was just as much a part of table life as camaraderie. Arguments over noise, over borrowed items never returned, over a boarder who consistently arrived late and disrupted the household's careful rhythm. These appear again and again in landladies' letters and diaries, alongside the warmer recollections. Class tension, too, simmered beneath the surface more often than the tidier popular memory of boarding house life tends to suggest. A mill girl and a bank clerk might share a table, but rarely did they share an equal footing at it, and the small daily indignities of that imbalance, who got served first, whose opinion carried more weight in conversation, were rarely erased simply by proximity. And yet, for all that friction, something genuine clearly took root in these houses, something that boarders themselves recognized as valuable even while they lived it. Letters home, preserved in family archives and local historical societies, repeatedly describe boarding house companions not as mere housemates, but using warmer language entirely. Like a second family, one young clerk wrote to his mother in 1868, describing an evening spent at his boarding house table. Another boarder, a young woman working as a governess, wrote of her landlady's dinner table as the only hour of the day that felt like home. It's this quality, this strange, unplanned intimacy, built entirely from necessity rather than choice, that makes the Victorian boarding house such a rich subject for historians and such a compelling one for us tonight. Because in an era we tend to remember, through its rigid class structures and its formal social codes, the boarding house table represented something quietly radical, a space where a widow of some standing, a factory girl, a pair of ambitious young clerks, and an itinerant sailor might, for 1 hour each evening, simply be people sharing a meal. It rarely lasted, of course. Boarders came and went, sometimes after a single season, sometimes after years, moving on to marriages, to better lodgings as their fortunes improved, to entirely new cities, as opportunity called them, elsewhere. The particular constellation of personalities around any given table was, by its very nature, temporary. But while it lasted, it was, for many of the people who lived it, one of the defining social experiences of their young adult lives. a bridge between the family they'd left behind in some distant village, and whatever family they might eventually build for themselves in the city. And it's around exactly this kind of table, ordinary, crowded, and full of quiet human detail, that our story now turns toward its second mystery. Because if Mr. Caro's disappearance left Mrs. Whitfield with unanswered questions, what happened 3 years later, during the particularly harsh winter of 1878, would leave the entire household with a memory none of them ever fully explained. The winter of 1878. By the winter of 1878, Mrs. Whitfield had been keeping her boarding house for nearly 6 years. The household had changed many times over. Thomas and William, the two rival clerks, had both long since moved on, one to marriage, one to a better position in another city. Mrs. Pell had passed away peacefully 2 winters earlier, mourned by the household with a genuine grief that surprised even Mrs. Whitfield herself. Susan, now 23, still boarded in the small room off the kitchen, though she had been promoted to a supervisory position at the mill, and increasingly spoke of saving enough to rent rooms of her own. That winter, remembered locally as one of the coldest in a decade, with the Thames itself reported to have partially frozen near the city, Mrs. Whitfield took in a new boarder for room 7. The same room, as it happened, that Mr. Caro had vacated so abruptly 3 years before, though by 1878 the household had long since stopped thinking of it as anything other than an ordinary room. Her name was Miss Eleanor Gray. She was, by her own account, 26 years old, a school teacher recently arrived to take up a position at a girls' academy across the city. She arrived with 2 modest trunks, excellent references from a school in the north, and a manner so quiet and self-possessed that Mrs. Whitfield, by her own later admission, found herself immediately at ease in a way she rarely was with a new boarder. For the first several weeks, Miss Gray settled into the household precisely as her references had suggested she would. She rose early, kept her room in immaculate order, and in the evenings often sat with the other boarders in the shared parlor, correcting examination papers by lamplight, while quietly following the conversation around her. She was, by every account, well liked. Susan in particular grew fond of her, the 2 women close enough in age to form the kind of easy friendship that boarding house life sometimes produced between women thrown together by circumstance. But as December wore on and the cold deepened, something in Miss Gray's manner began, subtly, to change. It started, according to the household's later recollection, with sleep, or rather, the lack of it. Susan, whose room shared a wall with room 7, began to notice that Miss Gray was awake at hours. No schoolteacher, however diligent, had any real reason to be awake. Footsteps back and forth across the small room, sometimes for an hour or more, well past midnight. On several occasions, Susan reported hearing what sounded like weeping. Quiet, controlled, the kind of crying someone does when they're trying very hard not to be heard. Mrs. Whitfield, ever attentive to the emotional undercurrents of her household, raised the matter gently over breakfast one morning, asking Miss Gray, in the careful, indirect way Victorian propriety demanded, whether she was quite well, whether the position at the academy was proving more difficult than expected, whether there was anything troubling her that the household might help ease. Miss Gray's response, according to Mrs. Whitfield's own later account, was polite, composed, and entirely unrevealing. She thanked Mrs. Whitfield for her concern, assured her that all was well, and attributed her sleeplessness to nothing more than the unfamiliarity of a new position and a new city. It was, on its face, a perfectly reasonable explanation. One Mrs. Whitfield, who had seen dozens of young boarders struggle with exactly this kind of homesickness and adjustment, had no immediate reason to doubt. And yet the household's collective unease continued to grow through the following weeks, fed by a series of small, difficult-to-explain details that individually meant very little, but together began to form a pattern no one could quite articulate. Miss Grey began receiving letters, frequent ones, sometimes 2 or 3 a week, far more correspondence than most boarders received in a month. This alone wasn't unusual. Many boarders received regular letters from family. What was unusual, Susan later recalled, was Miss Grey's reaction to them. She would take each letter from the hall table the moment it arrived, before anyone else in the household had a chance to see the handwriting or the postmark, and retreat immediately to her room to read it in private. A level of secrecy around ordinary correspondence that stood in sharp contrast to the household's usual habit of sharing news from home over the dinner table. On 2 separate occasions that winter, according to the account preserved in a letter Mrs. Whitfield later wrote to her sister, a man was seen loitering on the street outside the house in the evening, not approaching the door, not making any obvious attempt at contact, simply standing at a distance, watching the house, before eventually walking on. Susan, who spotted him the second time while returning from an evening errand, described him only as tall, well-dressed, and unfamiliar to the neighborhood. When she mentioned it to Miss Grey the following morning, thinking little of it beyond idle curiosity, Miss Grey's reaction was, by Susan's account, immediate and telling. She grew visibly pale, asked several sharp questions about exactly what the man had looked like and how long he had stood there, and then, catching herself, quickly waved the matter away as nothing worth discussing further. The household's unease reached its peak on a night in late January, during the worst of that winter's cold snap. Susan, unable to sleep herself, later reported waking near 3 in the morning to the unmistakable sound of Miss Grey's door opening, followed by soft footsteps on the stairs. Careful, deliberate footsteps, clearly trying not to wake the household. Susan, out of a mixture of concern and simple curiosity, rose and looked out from her own doorway, in time to see Miss Grey, still in her nightclothes but wrapped in a heavy coat, standing at the front door of the house. What happened next is preserved only through Susan's account, retold to Mrs. Whitfield the following morning, and later passed down through the family's oral history. There is no more objective record than that. But according to Susan, Miss Grey stood at the door for several long minutes, her hand on the latch, apparently on the verge of leaving the house entirely, alone, in the middle of a freezing winter night. And then, for reasons Susan could not explain, and Miss Grey never did either, she simply stopped. She stood motionless for what Susan estimated to be nearly a quarter of an hour, and then quietly turned and went back up the stairs to her room, without ever opening the door. Susan said nothing that night, uncertain whether she had witnessed something significant or simply an ordinary bout of sleeplessness and restlessness that happened to end at the front door rather than anywhere else in the house. But the following morning, She confided the entire episode to Mrs. Whitfield. It was this conversation, according to the family's account, that finally prompted Mrs. Whitfield to act with more directness than her usual careful discretion allowed. She sought out Miss Gray privately that afternoon and gently but plainly told her what Susan had witnessed and asked her, as one woman to another, setting aside for a moment the formal distance between landlady and boarder, whether she was in some kind of trouble, and whether there was anything Mrs. Whitfield could do to help. What followed was, by Mrs. Whitfield's own account, one of the more difficult and emotional conversations of her years running the house. Miss Gray, after a long silence, finally spoke, not with the full explanation Mrs. Whitfield had perhaps hoped for, but with enough to finally make sense of the winter's strange pattern. She admitted carefully and with evident distress that she was indeed being watched, not by a stranger with sinister intent, as the household had begun to fear, but by someone from her own past, a man to whom she had once been engaged in the northern city she'd left behind, an engagement that had ended badly enough that she had felt compelled to leave not just the relationship, but the entire city, taking the position at the academy under circumstances she preferred not to fully explain. The letters, she admitted, were his, increasingly desperate, sometimes pleading, occasionally, in a manner she found frightening enough that she had begun burning them rather than keeping them, threatening in tone. The man seen watching the house had very likely been him, having tracked her new address through channels she could only guess at. And the night at the door, this, she explained with visible difficulty, had been a moment of pure exhausted despair, a fleeting and irrational impulse to simply leave, to disappear into the night and start over yet again, somewhere he could never find her. An impulse that had passed only when the practical impossibility of it, in the dead of a freezing January night with nowhere to go, finally overcame the panic that had driven her to the door in the first place. Mrs. Whitfield, to her considerable credit, did not treat this confession as a scandal to be managed or a problem to be quietly resolved by asking Miss Gray to leave, a response that would not have been unusual for a landlady concerned above all with her house's respectability. Instead, according to the family's account, she did something that speaks to exactly the kind of quiet authority landladies of this era sometimes wielded on behalf of the women in their care. She informed Miss Gray that the household would take precautions. The front door would be more carefully secured, and any unfamiliar visitor inquiring after Miss Gray would be firmly and immediately turned away, with no information offered. And she made it clear, in terms Miss Gray apparently found deeply moving, that so long as she chose to remain, she was under Mrs. Whitfield's protection, in every sense that phrase could reasonably carry in a Victorian household. Whether it was this new vigilance, or simply the passage of time and distance, the man was never seen outside the house again after that January. Miss Gray's letters, by Mrs. Whitfield's account, tapered off through the spring and stopped entirely by early summer. Whatever pursuit had followed her from the north, it appears, eventually exhausted itself. Miss Gray remained at the house for nearly 2 more years, gradually returning by every account to the composed and quietly warm presence she had been when she first arrived. She and Susan remained close throughout, a friendship that, according to a fragment of correspondence preserved much later in the family's records, continued even after Miss Gray eventually left the boarding house to marry a fellow schoolteacher, in what the household understood to be a genuinely happy match, entered into on her own terms and in her own time. It's a story, in the end, without a true villain ever fully unmasked, and without the kind of dramatic conclusion the household's winter of anxious watching might have led one to expect. The man from Miss Gray's past was never confronted, never identified by name in any surviving record, never brought to any kind of reckoning beyond simply fading from her life as mysteriously as he had reappeared in it. What survives instead is something quieter, and in its own way, more remarkable. The record of a household of near strangers, who, faced with one among them in genuine and frightening trouble, closed ranks around her without hesitation. Historians studying boarding house life point to episodes like this, imperfectly documented, filtered through family memory rather than official record, as so much of this history necessarily is, as some of the clearest evidence of what made these households genuinely significant beyond their simple economic function. In a century that offered women like Miss Gray remarkably few formal protections against exactly the kind of pursuit she experienced, the informal protection of a landlady's household, a locked door, a united front of housemates, a woman like Mrs. Whitfield willing to stand between her boarder and whatever threat followed her from the past, filled a gap that no institution of the period was otherwise equipped to fill. It's worth sitting with that for a moment, on a winter night, not unlike the one Miss Gray once stood at that door, wondering whether to disappear into the cold. The Victorian boarding house is so often remembered, when it's remembered at all, as a footnote of economic history, a housing solution for an industrializing century, a line item in a census report. But beneath that dry economic surface was something far more human, a network of ordinary people bound by nothing more than shared walls and shared meals, who nonetheless found themselves capable of extraordinary loyalty to one another, when loyalty was what the moment required. Mrs. Whitfield kept her boarding house for over 20 years in total, by the family's account, watching hundreds of boarders pass through her doors, most of them living lives of complete historical anonymity, remembered by no one beyond the brief mention of their name in a ledger long since lost to time. But a handful of them, Mr. Carow, with his sealed envelope and his unexplained departure, Miss Gray, with her winter of watched windows and unanswered letters, left behind just enough of a trace in family memory and private correspondence that their stories survived, however incompletely, into the record we can still glimpse today. And it's worth wondering, as we sit with these two stories tonight, how many others there were. How many boarders passed through houses just like Mrs. Whitfield's, carrying secrets, fears, or reinventions of their own, that left no trace at all, no letter home, no family story passed down, nothing but a name in a ledger that was eventually thrown away, and a room that was let to someone else the following week. The winter fever. If the story of Mr. Carow tested Mrs. Whitfield's composure, and the winter of Miss Gray tested her courage, then what happened in the January of 1881 tested something far more fundamental: the household's survival itself. It began, as these things so often did in the 19th century, with something small. A cough. Nothing more than that, at first. One of the newer boarders, a young dock clerk named Albert Rowe, who had taken the room formerly occupied by Miss Gray, came down to breakfast one morning, looking pale and complaining of a sore throat. Mrs. Whitfield, who had seen dozens of boarders through dozens of minor winter ailments over the years, thought little of it beyond sending him back up to bed with a hot drink and firm instructions to rest. By the following evening, Albert had a fever high enough that Mrs. Whitfield, alarmed, sent for the local physician, and by the end of that week, the fever had spread. First to the boarder in the room next to his, then to Susan, then to two of the three newer lodgers who had joined the household that autumn. The physician's diagnosis, recorded in a fragment of correspondence that survives in the family archive, was typhoid, a word that, in 1881, carried with it a weight of dread that's difficult for a modern audience to fully appreciate. Typhoid fever was, at the time, one of the great unsolved terrors of Victorian urban life, spreading through contaminated water and poor sanitation in exactly the crowded, densely populated neighborhoods where boarding houses like Mrs. Whitfield's were most common. It killed indiscriminately, the young and old, the strong and the frail. And in an era before antibiotics, the only real treatment available was rest, careful nursing, and the anxious hope that a patient's own constitution would be strong enough to see them through the fever's course. For a boarding house, an outbreak of this kind represented something close to an existential crisis, and it's worth understanding exactly why. Because the danger here was never only medical. The first and most immediate danger, of course, was to the boarders themselves. 5 members of the household now confined to bed, dependent entirely on Mrs. Whitfield, and whichever boarders remained healthy enough to nurse them. But close behind that danger was a second, quieter one. And it's this second danger that historians point to as one of the most precarious aspects of running a Victorian boarding house. Reputation. Word of illness in a boarding house spread through a neighborhood almost as fast as the illness itself spread through the house. And for a landlady, whose entire livelihood depended on a steady stream of boarders willing to trust her with their health and safety, a reputation for harboring fever could be catastrophic. Existing boarders frightened into leaving, prospective boarders steering clear for months or even years afterward, and in the very worst cases, formal inquiries from parish health authorities that could result in a house being closed entirely. Mrs. Whitfield, according to the family's account, faced this crisis with the same combination of practical resolve and quiet care that had defined her handling of every difficulty before it. Though this time, the stakes were measured not in reputation or unanswered questions, but in lives. She converted the small parlor, rarely used in winter, into a makeshift sick room, reasoning that keeping the fevered boarders together and away from the healthy ones offered the best chance of containing the outbreak. An instinct that, while she had no formal medical knowledge to explain why, aligned closely with what physicians of the era were only beginning to understand about the contagious nature of the disease. She boiled every drop of water that entered the house, having been told by the physician that the fever traveled through tainted water supplies, and enforced this rule with an intensity that some of the healthier boarders, in later recollections, described as bordering on obsessive, though obsession, in this case, likely saved lives. She nursed the sick herself, through nights that stretched on with almost no sleep, changing linens soaked through with fever sweat, spooning what broth she could get down, feverish patients too weak to feed themselves. And, in the case of young Albert Rowe, whose fever climbed dangerously high in the second week of the outbreak, sitting through an entire night at his bedside, by the family's account, convinced he would not survive until morning. He did survive. So, eventually, did all 5 of the household's fever patients, though the recovery for some stretched on for months, the particular exhaustion and weakness typhoid left behind, lingering long after the fever itself had broken. Susan, who had been among the more severely affected, did not return to full strength until well into the spring, and by her own later account, credited her survival directly to the quality of care Mrs. Whitfield provided during the worst weeks of her illness. But the crisis extracted a cost beyond the physical toll on those who fell ill. It's here that the surviving financial fragments of Mrs. Whitfield's ledger, pieced together by historians studying similar boarding house records from the period, reveal just how precarious the economics of this world truly were, even for a landlady as capable as she had proven herself to be over nearly a decade of running the house. With 5 boarders unable to work, and therefore unable to pay their weekly fees, Mrs. Whitfield's income for that period collapsed to a fraction of its normal level, even as her expenses, coal for the extra fires needed in the makeshift sick room, the physician's repeated visits, special foods recommended for fever patients that cost considerably more than her usual household budget allowed, climbed sharply in the opposite direction. It was, in the plainest financial terms, exactly the kind of crisis that could permanently ruin a landlady operating without savings, without credit, and without any of the safety nets a modern small business owner might take for granted. That she survived it, that the household survived it, boarders and landlady alike, speaks to something historians consistently point to as a defining feature of the boarding house economy: the informal financial support that existed, unwritten and unenforced by any contract, between a landlady and her longer-term boarders. Susan, once well enough to work again, insisted on repaying not only her missed rent from the fever weeks, but an additional sum toward what she understood, without ever being told directly, had been an extraordinarily difficult financial period for the household. Albert Rowe, similarly, upon returning to full health and full wages, quietly paid considerably more than his strict back rent required, in what he later described in a letter to his own family, simply as a debt of gratitude that money could only partially repay. This pattern, boarders and landladies extending each other credit, forgiveness, and support through crises that no formal system was equipped to absorb, appears again and again in the surviving records of Victorian boarding house life, and it's one of the details historians most often cite when arguing that these houses functioned as something closer to informal mutual aid societies than simple landlord-tenant arrangements. There was no insurance to file a claim against, no social safety net beyond the household itself. What there was, instead, was an accumulated trust, built meal by meal, season by season, that in the moment of genuine crisis revealed itself to be sturdier than anyone might have expected from a group of people who, strictly speaking, were only ever strangers who happened to share a table. The outbreak of 1881 left its mark on the household in other ways too, some of them permanent. One of the newer boarders, a young woman who had joined the house only weeks before the fever struck, chose not to return after recovering enough to travel, moving instead to live with an aunt in a nearby town. An entirely understandable choice, Mrs. Whitfield noted without bitterness in a letter to her sister, given how frightening the ordeal had been for someone so new to the household and its ways. But the core of the household, Susan, Albert, and the boarders who had weathered the crisis together, emerged from that winter bound to one another, and to Mrs. Whitfield, by something considerably deeper than the ordinary rhythms of boarding house life had produced before. It's a pattern worth noting, because it appears in boarding house records across the century, in cities on both sides of the Atlantic. Crisis, more often than not, didn't dissolve these improvised households. It consolidated them. Fire, illness, economic hardship, even the ordinary Victorian catastrophe of a sudden and unexpected death. These events, so often the very things that might be expected to expose the fragility of a household, built on nothing more than shared rent and shared walls, instead tended to reveal exactly how much genuine loyalty had accumulated beneath the surface of that seemingly transactional arrangement. Mrs. Whitfield, for her part, continued keeping her boarding house for another decade after the fever winter of 1881, though the family's account notes that she never again allowed a boarder to arrive without insisting, more firmly than she once had, on knowing at least a little more about their circumstances than politeness alone required. A small, understandable hardening, born of a winter that had taught her, in the most direct way possible, exactly what she stood to lose. And it's here, at the edge of this particular household story, that we begin to approach the end of the era itself. Because the world that made Mrs. Whitfield's boarding house necessary, the world of crowded row houses and shared washrooms and landladies boiling water against a fever no one yet fully understood, was already, by the final decades of the century, beginning to change beneath her feet. The door that closed every era, no matter how deeply woven into the fabric of daily life it once seemed, eventually comes to an end. And the era of the Victorian boarding house was no exception. By the final years of the 19th century, and increasingly through the early decades of the 20th, the forces that had made Mrs. Whitfield's world so necessary began, one by one, to disappear. Cities modernized, plumbing improved, and with it came something that sounds almost too ordinary to have reshaped an entire social institution: the private bathroom. Where once an entire household of boarders shared a single washroom down the hall, new buildings increasingly offered individual conveniences and the intimate, unavoidable closeness of communal boarding house life began, quietly, to feel less like a necessity and more like an imposition. Kitchens changed too. Gas stoves, and eventually electric ones, made cooking simpler and safer than the coal-fired ranges Mrs. Whitfield had spent decades mastering. Small, efficient apartments, what we would now recognize as studio flats, began appearing in growing numbers, offering young workers something the boarding house never quite could: true privacy, a space entirely their own, without a landlady's watchful presence in the hallway, or a stranger's cough through a shared wall at night. Wages rose gradually across the industrial world, and with them came something else: choice. A young clerk in 1905 could often afford what a young clerk in 1875 simply could not: rooms of his own, however modest, rather than a shared table and a supervised parlor. And as choice expanded, the particular economic necessity that had once made boarding nearly universal, that one household in 5, one household in 8, began, decade by decade, to shrink. The First World War and the vast social changes it brought in its wake accelerated the decline further still. Young women increasingly worked in occupations and lived in arrangements that would have been unthinkable to Susan or Miss Gray a generation earlier. The rigid Victorian codes that had once made a landlady's supervision feel not just practical, but morally necessary, began to loosen, and with that loosening, much of the boarding house's original social function simply became unnecessary. By the middle of the 20th century, the great era of the urban boarding house, the world of Mrs. Whitfield, of Room 7, of long tables crowded with strangers who had slowly, meal by meal, become something like family, had largely faded into memory. The row houses that once held 8 or 10 boarders under a single roof were, in many cities, converted back into single-family homes, or subdivided instead into the small private apartments that had made the old arrangement obsolete in the first place. The brass plaques reading rooms available came down, one by one, and were rarely replaced. And yet, something about this world refuses to disappear entirely, which is perhaps why we've spent this hour together tonight, stepping back through a door that closed for good more than a century ago. Historians who study this period keep returning to the same observation, phrased in slightly different ways depending on who's writing. The boarding house, whatever its practical shortcomings, solved a problem that modern urban life never fully stopped having: the problem of arriving somewhere new, entirely alone, with no one who already knows your name. Picture, one final time, that platform where we began this story. The year 1872. 23 years old, a small bag, a handful of coins, and no idea where you'll sleep tonight. That particular kind of vulnerability, arriving in a place that doesn't yet know you exist, hasn't gone anywhere, even if the brass plaques have. It simply looks different now. A studio apartment found through an app rather than a knock on a stranger's door. A city of neighbors who might never learn each other's names, let alone share a table together most evenings for years at a stretch. What the Victorian boarding house offered, however imperfectly, however shaped by the rigid social codes and quiet crises of its era, was an answer to that particular loneliness that modern urban life, for all its comforts, has never quite managed to replicate. Not a perfect answer, not always a comfortable one, as Susan or Miss Gray or even Mrs. Whitfield herself, in her most exhausted hours, might have told you, but a real one, built one shared meal at a time. We'll never know, with any real certainty, who Mr. Edmund Caro truly was, or what conversation Susan overheard through a locked door at 2 a.m. We'll never know the name of the man who once stood watching Mrs. Whitfield's house from across the street, or whether Miss Gray ever told him, wherever he eventually settled, that she had found the family he never quite managed to be part of. These are the kinds of gaps that history, however carefully pieced together from surviving letters and family memory, simply cannot close. They remain, and perhaps always will remain, exactly what they were to the household that lived through them. Mysteries, resolved only partially, if at all. But perhaps that's fitting, because the boarding house itself was never really about certainty. It was about strangers choosing, night after night, to sit down at the same table anyway. Not because they had to know everything about each other, but because they had for a while nowhere else to be, and no one else to be there with. On some autumn Sunday in 1878, in a house not unlike Mrs. Whitfield's, 8 strangers once sat around a table eating a simple meal of meat and bread, listening to one another's stories, none of them quite family, and none of them, by the end of the evening, quite strangers either. That, in the end, is what the Victorian boarding house really was. Not simply a housing arrangement for an industrializing century, a way of not being alone. And so, as we close the door on this particular house and on this particular story, it leaves behind one question worth carrying with you. Long after tonight, long after this fire in your mind has burned down to embers, and sleep has finally found you. Wherever you are tonight, whoever is near you, or however far you might feel from anyone at all, who is it that you're sharing your table with? Wherever you're listening from tonight, I hope you feel, just for a moment, some of the warmth of that old house. The fire in the parlor grate, the low murmur of conversation around a crowded table, the particular comfort of knowing that behind at least one door, someone was glad you'd arrived. Thank you for spending this hour with me. Sleep well.